But now a new person has come forward who is using a pseudonym. Sean was 16 years old when he says he was driven from the Kincora Boys' Home in Belfast to Classy-Bon in the summer of 1977. As the men who had brought them waited outside, Sean remembered being taken into a darkened room where he was joined by a man who dressed me and then gave me oral sex. I was there for about an hour. He spoke quietly and he tried to make me feel comfortable. He was one of those men who wanted attention. He wanted you to chase him. I think he felt some shame. He said very sadly, "I hate these feelings." He seemed a sad and lonely person. I think the darkened room was all about denial. He grabbed my hand and put it on his chest. I only recognized who he was when I saw on the news that Lord Mountbatten had been killed. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise. We're going to keep going in the Mountbattens today. We're almost done. We're going to cover 2 chapters today. The first chapter is called Ireland, and the second chapter, which is very long, is called Rumors. And that is where we're really going to explore the idea that Louis Mountbatten may not have been straight. It would appear that he was either homosexual or bisexual, however you want to define those terms. And it would appear that this was pretty much an open secret. Now there are some people who would deny it, but the people who deny it are very small versus all of the sources of people and the evidence that exists to say that he definitely had his interests. So I would just like to say that for this whole episode, I mean, when what we're talking about in Ireland, he's being assassinated. And then the second part of the episode is going to be all about his sexual proclivities. So this would not be an episode for children to be around. So if you happen to have little kids running through the house, listen to this one with earphones on, because it's, some of it's a little grody. A little. It's fairly shocking, honestly. Okay, so because it's so long, I won't chitter chatter. Also, I just want to say that with this Ireland chapter, we're actually going to start in the middle of the chapter because the relevant part of this chapter is towards the end, where we talk about how it is that he even came to be in a situation in which he could be assassinated. The first part of the chapter, we're not missing out anything there. It's really just talking about what kind of grandfather he was and how the grandchildren related to him, that he was very affectionate, though they did always kind of know it's his way or the highway. You know, you never crossed him. What he wanted was what you did. He was very charming about it. Everyone was charmed to do what he wanted, but there was this very, very clear message with anyone who ever interacted with him. Whatever grandfather wants to do, that's what we're going to do. He's going to run whatever show. If we're ever on vacation with him, well, we eat what he wants, we do what he wants, we go where he wants us to go, and that's just how it is. But, you know, he was charming with them, and they didn't have any problems. So that's kind of why we're just going to skim over that a little bit. It was interesting, but we just have so much that we need to cover today that we're just going to get right into why he was in Ireland and what happened to him in Ireland, and then we can get into the chapter about the rumors. So where we're going to begin says, in 1976, 20 members of the Garda were assigned to guard Mountbatten. Reviewing security in the spring of 1978, Scotland Yard decided that Mountbatten was also at risk in London, and there were extra car patrols near Kinnerton Street. In August, an attempt to shoot him on his boat was only aborted when choppy seas prevented the sniper lining up his target. The same year, a loosened bung was found in Shadow 5. It was clear the IRA was narrowing in for the kill. Early in the summer of 1979, the broadcaster, Ludovic Kennedy, went to Broadlands to record an obituary program. He wrote, "Mountbatten looked much older than when we had last met, still handsome and alert, but with deaf aids in both ears, wearing a blazer that now hung loosely on him, and in his walk the beginnings of old man's shuffle. He had kindly invited us to what he called a light lunch, which consisted of an egg dish, lamb cutlets, a pudding, cheese, and a dessert of frosted red currants, all served by a bearded butler and 2 footmen in naval battle dress. After lunch, Mountbatten was filmed talking about his life and the funeral arrangements that he wanted. Was all this an act of consideration to preempt family arguments? Kennedy wondered, or yet another example of his abiding vanity? I think we could assume it was his abiding vanity. The summer was spent compiling a picture book to mark his 80th birthday, 80 years in pictures. The idea had been that of Barbara Cutland. John Brayborn was against it, to protect a projected authorized biography in which the family had a financial stake. And much of the work was done by John Barrett. John Barrett is his secretary. But Mountbatten relished the opportunity to look at his life again. David Roberts, the editor on the book, remembers visiting Mountbatten at Broadlands to go through the proofs. The photographs I was looking through were much more interesting than snaps of Errol Flynn or Chaplin. They'd been censored, to be sure, but there were still photos of Princess Anne in a grass skirt dancing on the royal yacht, and intimate photos of Edward VIII. There was touching photographs of the Tsar's children, who were slaughtered during the Revolution. The idea of Mountbatten as a child playing with those doomed children was touching. There were lots of photos of Mountbatten's girlfriends, of which he seemed proud, and I did wonder if they were disguising other tastes. When he had nothing better to do, Mountbatten would come down to the photo archive in the basement to see how I was getting on, and on one occasion invited me up to lunch with him. It was a beautiful day, and we sat outside on a little table on a terrace overlooking the Test, the river whose course Capability Brown had changed so that we could enjoy its serene magnificence from the house. The butler came to serve us with 3 frankfurters, and Mountbatten solemnly cut 1 in half, so we had equal shares. The book was ready in time for Christmas, and Mountbatten was able to sign 6 copies just before he set off for his annual Irish holiday. In March, Sir Richard Sykes, British ambassador to the Netherlands, and the MP Ari Neve had been assassinated. In June, NATO Chief General Alexander Haig had narrowly escaped an IRA assassination attempt in Belgium, meant for a senior British Army officer. And in July, 2 IRA suspects were arrested on Lough Raw, some 10 miles from the County Monaghan home of one of the IRA's top bomb makers, the Libyan-trained Thomas McMahon. Shortly afterwards, Mountbatten was advised not to go to Ireland by Chief Superintendent David Bicknell. "But the Irish are my friends," he replied. "Not all of them, my lord," replied Bicknell. In spite of that, Mountbatten left at the beginning of August. Pamela, with 2 of her 3 children, would be there for the whole month, and Patricia and her family planned to join them from their nearby holiday home. However, security was stepped up when 28 men provided a day and night guard at Classybon and a further 12 at Asleague. One of those responsible for the family's security was a 21-year-old corporal with the SAS Guard, 117 Provost Company, the Army's elite close protection unit, Graham Ewell, who had previously been personal bodyguard to General David Miller, commander of the Ulster Defense Regiment. At the end of July, he conducted a full risk assessment identifying Shadow 5, which was often moored in the public bay and could be easily boarded unseen at night, as a most likely target. What especially concerned him was a car registered in Belfast. I remember the license plate to this day, kept returning to the quayside. At one point, I remembered looking at its occupants through binoculars. He was looking towards the boat through binoculars to the water. He must have been 200 yards from the quay. Ewell claims that, according to intelligence just a few days after the event, that said vehicle was already known to the RUC and Army intelligence as a vehicle frequently used by the IRA for gun running and transporting bombs for the IRA. What's more, that vehicle had been bugged for months by British Army intelligence tracking its movements. But Ewell's report was not acted on, and shortly afterwards he told his services were no longer required, and the Garda would henceforth be handling security. He was forced to sign a gagging order, which only expired in 2017. The lack of security on the boat is confirmed in a letter from Robin Hayden, British ambassador to Ireland, to the Foreign Secretary, Lord Carrington, explaining it was the first year the boat had not been guarded during the day nor searched before it sailed. That's all very curious, if you ask me. Why would this one person who's raising the alarms and saying, hey, there's some cars out there there's a car out there that keeps showing up, and I've watched them watch the boat, and I have concerns, and he finds out that they know that this is a car that belongs to the IRA that's constantly running bombs and guns back and forth, and that they've got the car bugged. But they let this guy go, who raised the alarm, who it would appear was doing exactly what he had been tasked to do in the first place. And then that Mountbatten's boat would not be guarded during the day, and that they would literally let him go on it without searching it after it had been in a public place all night long and nobody was watching it. It almost feels like somebody wanted this to happen. Monday, 27 August, a bank holiday, was a gloriously sunny day. After days of rain, the family had decided at breakfast that morning to drive the mile to Mullimore and to go out on the 29-foot Donegal fishing boat Shadow 5 and lift the lobster pots that they had set the previous day. Dickie's grandchildren, Edwina and Nicholas, known as Nicky, had been playing backgammon. She decided to remain behind, but the young boy was keen to go, telling his cousin that they'd finish the game on his return. Setting off after a late breakfast, they were accompanied by their guard of protection, Kevin Henry, and a uniform officer. At 11:30 a.m., Mountbatten, his daughter Patricia and her husband John, his 83-year-old mother Doreen, and Patricia's 14-year-old twins Nicholas and Timothy, together with 15-year-old Paul Maxwell, who holidayed in the village and helped with the boat, boarded Shadow 5. With the two guarded detectives following the progress of the boat through the binoculars from the shore, the boat cleared the harbor wall and headed for the open bay. Mountbatten, standing tall at the wheel, opened the throttle to gain speed. Also watching the progress of the boat through binoculars were another two pair of eyes, belonging to members of the provincial IRA. At exactly 11:45 a.m., just as their boat reached the lobster pots, a few hundred yards away on the cliff top overlooking the bay, the pirate team pressed the button, which activated the bomb they had planted on the boat moored in the bay the night before. 50 pounds of gelignite exploded, sending showers of timber, metal, cushions, life jackets, and shoes into the air. Then there was a deadly silence. Mountbatten's body, his legs severed, and most of his clothes ripped off in the blast except for a fragment of his long-sleeved jersey with the badge of HMS Kelly on the front, was found floating face downwards in the water. He had been killed instantly. Shortly afterwards, the provincial IRA issued a statement through the Republican News in Belfast to the Press Association that the IRA has claimed responsibility for the execution of Lord Louis Mountbatten. It's a really shocking end to, quite a grand life. Granted, he was elderly, so I suppose we can be happy that no one managed to cut him down in the prime of his life. But imagine taking your family out on the boat to go check the lobster pots, and you're murdered. You and your family. Arrangements for Mountbatten's funeral, codenamed Operation Freeman, had been in hand since 1967, and regularly assessed and refined with the latest news in March 1979. In 1971, Mountbatten, who wanted a magnificent state occasion, had outlined exactly what he wanted from the funeral service itself through to his burial. After first considering the Isle of Wight with his parents, he had opted for Romsey. Claiming that he did not mind what form the service took, he then gave specific instructions over 8 pages, and with a 4-page appendix. In death, as in life, Mountbatten would be a stickler for detail and the proper etiquette. He wanted the state funeral to follow the format of his father and was anxious to know what he was entitled to as an admiral of the fleet. How large a naval gun crew might he have? Could extra Royal Marines take part, given that he had been colonel commander? Should the French government send an official representative? Where should his coffin rest before the funeral, and which organization should send representatives? When the Lord Chamberlain, Lord Maclean, objected to ideas that were not in keeping with Mountbatten's position in the royal family, Dickey simply went above his head to the Queen. The funeral took place on Wednesday, September 5th, at Westminster Abbey, with 1,400 guests, including the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, the Prince of Wales, most of the crowned heads of Europe, Margaret Thatcher, and 4 former prime ministers, and was televised in over 20 countries. As the funeral procession wound its way from the Chapel Royal to the Abbey, the gun carriage pulled by 130 sailors, it was watched by a crowd of over 50,000 spectators. Alongside marched 8 pallbearers of 4 admirals, 3 generals, and a marshal of the Royal Air Force. In front was Lance Corporal of Horse Keith Nicklin of the Life Guards, leading Mountbatten's charger Dolly, with Mountbatten's shining black thigh boots prominently reversed in the stirrups, the symbols of his naval and military ranks, his gold stick as colonel of the Life Guards, his 3-cornered cocked hat as the admiral of the fleet, his sword, lay on the top of his coffin, covered by a Union Jack. 6 cushions were required to carry all his decorations. Walking behind were his grandsons Norton, Michael John, and Philip Knatchbull and Ashley Hicks, followed by the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince of Wales, Duke of Gloucester, Duke of Kent, and Prince Michael of Kent. Mountbatten had always joked about how sad he would be to miss his own funeral. His instructions had been carried out faithfully. A 19-gun salute from King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery, Eternal Father, I vow to thee my country, Jerusalem, the prayers of Sir Francis Drake in Psalm 107, they that can go down to the sea in ships, read by Prince Charles, following which he gave a 30-minute address. From Westminster the body was taken to Waterloo, and by train to Romsey, where he was interred in the side chapel of the Abbey. Further services took place all over Great Britain and Ireland. 2 days later, an ecumenical memorial service at St. Patrick's Cathedral, Dublin, attended by the Taoiseach and almost all of the Irish cabinet, a joint funeral for Nicholas and Lady Brabourne near the family home in Kent, and on September 16th, Stephen Roskill, not always a friend to Mountbatten when he was alive, spoke at a service opposite Mountbatten's old Cambridge College. He said it is certainly the case that when Mountbatten was born, a fairy godmother endowed him with lavish gifts, good looks and a fine presence, courage and determination, a very quick and original mind, and the capacity to win influential friends. Undoubtedly, he made the greatest possible use of these gifts. On December 20th, a memorial service was held at St. Paul's for 2,000 people, where the Prince of Wales again gave the address. He remembered, a constantly active brain which was never allowed a moment's rest. There was always a new challenge to be overcome, fresh projects to set in motion, more opposition to be defeated, all of which were pursued with a relentless and almost irresistible single-mindedness of purpose. Although he could certainly be ruthless with people when the occasion demanded, his infectious enthusiasm, his queer capacity for hard work, his wit, made him an irresistible leader among men. On Monday, November 5th, the trial of Thomas McMahon, aged 31, a bomb maker with strong links to the Pyra's South Armagh Brigade, who had been behind a series of landmine attacks against British troops, and Francis McGurl, aged 24, a known Pyra activist, opened in Dublin. The two men who had been acting suspiciously had been taken in for questioning at a routine road check even before the explosion. The evidence against them was circumstantial. The men had traces of gelignite on them, and McMahon had specks of green paint from Shadow 5, but intelligence confirmed that the attack had been ordered by Martin McGuinness, later Sinn Féin's chief negotiator in the Northern Ireland peace process. It also emerged that a member of Pyra who had taken responsibility for the Mullinmore attack had been a temporary member of staff during the 1978 holiday, and Shadow 5 had been under surveillance until August 18th, when the local Garda had decided to henceforth rely on visiting patrols. There had also, it appeared, been an unsuccessful attempt on Saturday, August 25th, but the bomb had failed to go off. On November 23rd, the court delivered its verdict. McMahon was sentenced to life imprisonment, but there was not enough evidence to convict the girl. John Courtney, who led the Garda investigation, found several others connected with the assassination. McMahon and McGurl had been taken into custody before the bomb was detonated, but it did not have enough evidence to bring charges. They included an IRA leader from Monaghan believing to have orchestrated the attack, who was questioned and then released, the bomb detonator, and 3 women living in a caravan opposite Mullinmore Harbour, who was suspected had been watchers. Of those who had come under suspicion, one still lives and works in Dublin as a journalist. Another was released under the Good Friday Agreement, whilst a third became a member of the Forum for Victims and Survivors. The Garda never closed the Mountbatten file because they believed it was a wider conspiracy, and they were hoping someone would rat out the people up the chain of command who ordered it, says veteran Northern Ireland journalist Martin Dillon. Like the Sheargar episode, senior IRA figures did not want their fingerprints on it. This source says the Garda had been sitting for decades on a list of guys that they would like to attach to the assassination, but no one is prepared to offer them up. If the IRA had thought their spectacular, for which they were reputedly later paid $2 million by Syria, would help their cause, they were to be disappointed. Public opinion was horrified by the senseless killing of teenagers and the elderly on holiday. There were calls for the reintroduction of capital punishment and the withdrawal of troops. It was something the British immediately exploited, in particular with regard to cooperation over security issues with the Republic and IRA financing from America, though, as a briefing paper for Mrs. Thatcher noted, the Dublin government is short on resources and long on political inhibitions. Amongst the opinions considered were the reintroduction of executive detention, the closure of 35 border crossings, increased use of the UDR and SAS, and improved cooperation between the RUC and the Army with more joint operations rooms. One of the ironies is that Mountbatten had been sympathetic to Republican aims and even offered himself as a middleman negotiator, but had been refused by Rory O'Brady, member of Sinn Féin. The provincial IRA had killed the wrong man. Well, it's a very sad ending to a life that was filled with contradictions, because here is yet one more contradiction. Here he was, married to a woman. He had lots of girlfriends, openly, dated tons of people. I mean, his wife was going to run around on him. He could have girlfriends too. And so you just have to ask yourself, how did he have time for more? But apparently he did have time for more. He had time for more men and for boys. And it's one of the most disconcerting chapters I've ever read. I don't know how he had time for all of this. But this is one of the things that is just so upsetting about human nature. It would seem that when you climb to the very top of the social ladder, when there is nothing that prohibits you from doing exactly what you want, people always seem to turn to perversion. Maybe that's a little bit naive of me to assume that you would do anything else with your time, but isn't there so many other things to do? Why does it always seem like these elite people eventually turn to rings of perversion in which they are doing appalling things? This is not like, well, people can have their likes as adults. I'm not going to tell you what you can do and can't do behind closed doors. You're going to have to answer for the way that you spend your time. But when we start talking kids, I got problems with what you're up to. Very concerning chapter. So again, if you have little ears around, this is not for little ears. All right, this is chapter 28. It's entitled Rumors. It begins by saying that during his life and after his death, rumors circulated about Mountbatten's sexuality, encouraged by his friendship with well-known homosexuals such as Noel Coward and Tom Dryburgh, his close working relationship with Peter Murphy, and his tactile behavior. It was a question that his official biographer addressed head-on. If Mountbatten was a practicing homosexual, he was risking everything he valued most to indulge in a fleeting appetite. In that case, his character was wholly different from anything delineated in this biography. All his naval contemporaries who have expressed an opinion on the subject, and some worked very close to him, state emphatically that they do not believe the stories to be true. Sex itself was not a matter of great importance to him. To suggest that such a man was actively homosexual seems to be flying not merely in the face of the evidence, but also of everything we understand about his character. And to that I have to say, official biographer, were you paying attention to him at all? Sex was massively important to him. If only as a means of control, of feeling important, of feeling like he was wanted. Talking about sex didn't matter to him. What else did we expect the official biographer to say? But that's disappointingly vague. And I also think that not very accurate about who he was, even if we knew him to be a straight person. If he didn't care about sex, what were all the girlfriends about? What was his devastation about the fact that his wife was constantly leaving to go have sex with somebody else? The book goes on to say that this view, though, that he couldn't possibly have been a homosexual and that it didn't follow his nature, was shared by his secretary, John Barrett. John Barrett said he certainly was not homosexual. The allegations that he consorted with young naval officers at his home in Kinnerton Street are preposterous. There's no possibility that he could have kept any homosexual activity secret from me in the intimate relationship that we had that lasted for 14 years of his life. That's what he says publicly. But later on in this chapter, there's other people who are like, yeah, John Barrett knew all about it. So the book is on to say that it's an issue that Brian Hoey, in his authorized book, also dismisses, quoting evidence from Sacha Abercorn, John Barrett, and Bill Evans, with the later claiming that stories of bisexuality are absolute rubbish. Men and boys weren't his thing at all. Hoey concluded that the most convincing argument against Mountbatten being bisexual is that in the 15 years since his death, no one has come forward claiming that he was his lover. And to that I say, Brian, I guess nobody jumped out of the woodwork and told you I used to be Mountbatten's lover, but plenty of people have come forward and been like, yeah, that guy and I were involved. Or I saw that guy with so-and-so. Or I walked in on this. Or, oh, yeah, my dad knew all about it. My dad worked with him. It's like, what are you talking about? No one's come out. That's all anybody's done is come out. Well, the book says that despite the ardent denials of all these people who were close to him, rumors continued to circulate. Just after Mountbatten's death, Private Eye ran a story, quote, "News that Lord Windenfeld has signed up naval historian Richard Huff to write an intimate family portrait of Earl Mountbatten raises speculation as to just how intimate a portrait this will be. Will it, for example, reveal that the old sailor, particularly in the last 19 years of his life following the death of his heiress wife, Edwina Ashley, was also a raving queen? Residents living close to his London home at 2 Kitterton Street, SW1, have hair-raising stories to tell of the rollicking all-male frolics held there by the aging Matelote. Lord Louis, it seems, had a preference for young servicemen. This worked to advantage both ways. Doing a turn for Dickie could do wonders for a young officer's career, and in turn, the former chief of the defense staff could count on the discipline of service life to ensure discretion, and not have to monkey around with the disreputable and mercenary John-come-home rent boys of Piccadilly. Writing of the Ziegler biography, the author Michael Thornton utterly disbelieved his insistence that there was no evidence to suggest Mountbatten was bisexual. My own knowledge of Dickie over the years suggested the opposite conclusion, and Noel Coward, whom I knew extremely well for the last 13 years of his life, told me it was beyond doubt, and to his certain knowledge that Dickie had had male as well as female lovers. The entrepreneur Jeremy Norman, whose business interests ranged from Burke's Peerage to the Embassy nightclub, and who met Mountbatten a couple of times, always thought he was gay. A crashing snob, interested in genealogy, loved uniforms and decorations, all typical of a gay man of that generation. There were rumors he was homosexual. I was surprised, but not that surprised, though I never saw any evidence, remembered Derek Meekins, who served on his staff in 1948. He was very manly. I'd heard about friendships with other women. They were quite happy to go their own way. Hugh Montgomery Massenburg, in his memoirs, wrote of Mountbatten's home in Kitterton Street that the tiny mews house stayed awash with young, muscular, suspiciously good-looking naval ratings bustling about the place to no apparent purpose. Jackie Cryer, who, together with the casting director Celestia Fox, worked in a clothes shop called Spice, owned by the Kinks Management, opposite the Kitterton Street flat, in 1964 to 1965, and often saw Mountbatten. He would flirt with them and joke about the strange clothes they were wearing, but then pretend not to recognize them if he saw them in Wilton Crescent, as if that was a different persona. He was hugely charismatic, always looked amazing with a cheeky smile and eyes, remembered Cryer. I always thought, here's serious grown-up crumpet. He was very dashing, elegant, dignified, with wonderful manners, but I couldn't help noticing the succession of handsome young men frequenting his flat through the day, including some rather shady characters. Sometimes they stood outside smoking, and it was a sixth sense that told me they were gay. The journalist Nicholas Davies recalled that in 1975 I helped write a series of articles for the London Daily Mirror which revealed details of a homosexual ring centered on the lifeguards' barracks in London. A number of young guardsmen informed me that Mountbatten was involved, and they gave detailed, signed statements of alleged visits to his Kitterton Street home. As a result of an international investigation by the Army, 5 lifeguard officers and 36 guardsmen were found guilty of homosexual activities and dismissed from the regiment. Francis Ween, the biographer of Tom Dryburgh and Private Eye journalist, had collected material on Mountbatten that was destroyed in a fire. It's so maddening that all my boxes of Dryburgh research went up in flames in that great shed fire, he wrote, as I know the Mountbatten file included, for instance, a letter sent to me by a chap who Mountbatten tried to seduce when he, my correspondent, was a 17-year-old rating. The young naval rating was lined up to go on a picnic with Mountbatten when the great man was visiting Malta, I think. And on the day, the youth was startled to discover that it was a do, and that Mountbatten assumed that the sailor was to be served as a human dessert. 17-year-old boy being preyed upon like this. Charlotte Breese wrote in her acclaimed biography Hutch, as for Lord Mountbatten's bisexuality, many of those I interviewed were convinced of it. When he was Supreme Allied Commander in Southeast Asia, several officers boasted of their liaisons with him. A naval friend came across him on an island when he was serving in Malta, nude, engaged with another officer. But these and other stories that refer to Mountbatten's sexual proclivities have been consistently denied by their family. Lord Louis's homo leanings were not any secret in the 14th Army messes, which I heard about on my return to Calcutta at the end of the war, according to Philip Hindon, who served with Mountbatten in India and Burma. The writer Elsa Seagrave remembered, "My father always claimed that Mountbatten, whom he'd met in the Navy, was, quote, a most frightful shit, and probably a bugger boy." According to someone in royal circles, they were divorcing just before he became viceroy, and he persuaded her to go. She enjoyed the starring role. They were living apart. He had men friends, often naval ratings, and she liked black men. A banker seconded to Bombay in the 70s heard various stories about Mountbatten's homosexual affairs. A long-standing Indian staff member of the bank had reputedly been one of his lovers. A Garda Special Branch officer heard stories about Mountbatten's assignations in India through the Indian High Commission in Dublin. James Lees Milne accounts in his wartime diaries, hearing from John Goulgood a story about, quote, M.B., who decoyed a young man into his Eaton Square house and made him strip M.B. and beat him. The young man laid on with such violence that M.B. screamed in agony, and the butler appeared. And when confronted with the scene, all the butler remarked was, "I thought you rang, sir." What is up with these people? What's going on with these elites? They're twisted in their sexual preferences. And then they love to add on a dose of violence on top of it. Is there truly nothing? Are they just like looking to experience everything because they feel dead because they've experienced so much that they can't get a high off of life anymore? So they're like, I'm going to get this young person to come in here and beat me within an inch of my life so I can feel something? I mean, that's weird, you guys. And the same thing, though, with Edward VIII and Wallace Simpson. They were also into this, hitting each other with whips, degrading each other. What is up with that? Like, you have to ask yourself, what demonic influence has entered my life in which I am purposefully trying to subjugate myself under shame and humiliation? What evilness would have to come into your life where you favored self-degradation? I mean, not to get too alarmist, but it's something that would start with, I'm going to self-degrade myself. I'm going to make myself ashamed. I'm going to belittle myself. I'm going to be beaten. Isn't the next step suicide? Isn't that exactly where the devil would want to take you? It's like, and all along you think it's all your choice. You're just, you're just trying something out. You're just being kinky. I don't know. That's weird. That is wild behavior to me. And then to call it also under the umbrella of sex, it isn't. It is the most twisted thing I've ever heard of. It's not the intimate thing that happens between a man and his wife, I'll tell you that much. I don't know what y'all are up to. That doesn't even fall into the category of sex. That is torture. Okay. This next bit's a little bit funny to me. It says here, in his memoir, To Kill and Kill Again, The Chilling True Confessions of a Serial Killer, published in 2002, the con man and murderer Archibald Hall, also known as Roy Fontaine, claimed to have been Mountbatten's lover during the war. Hall wrote that through the bisexual Vic Oliver, who was married to Winston Churchill's daughter, he was taken up by Ivor Novello, and at wartime parties in Novello's flat around the Strand Theatre, he met the playwright Terence Rattigan, conservative peer Lord Boothby, and Mountbatten. Paul Pender, who wrote a biography of Fontaine with his cooperation, asked him, "You mean you mounted Mountbatten?" "No," Roy replied, ever a stickler for detail. "Mountbatten mounted me. He believed it's better to give than to receive." Pender then asked Fontaine what he called his royal lover, to which the butler responded, most of Mountbatten's gay friends called him Mountbottom. "Did you call him Mountbottom?" "Of course not. That would have been disrespectful. I called him the Queen." Probably shouldn't laugh, but it's kind of funny. While research in their papers showed Ivor Novello and Terence Rattigan were friends, there is no evidence that Mountbatten knew either of them or Hall. Pender stands by Fontaine's claims, but Alan Nicol, in his biography of Fontaine, exercises caution. It is impossible to ascertain how many of Fontaine's recollections of early sexual exploits are true. If anything can be judged from his proven exaggerations elsewhere, it's fair to say that few of his boasted sexual adventures with the rich and famous of wartime Glasgow and London can be believed. That's probably where I fall. I mean, this man is a known con man, and those lines are just a little too practiced You know what I mean? Couldn't wait to be asked if he ever called him Mountbatten. Of course not, that would be disrespectful. I called him the Queen. I mean, it's funny. It's a funny joke, but it seems more like a skit than it does somebody's truthful explanations. In September 1987, an article appeared in the New Zealand tabloid magazine Truth, drawing on the testimony of Norman Neild, Mountbatten's driver between 1942 and 1943, who now lived in New Zealand, and had decided to tell his story after reading Spycatcher and after the death of his wife. "When I saw what all the fuss was about, I realized I had a better story to tell," Neild said. He claimed he was, quote, ordered to take young boys who had been procured for the Admiral to his official residence in Lord Mountbatten's Hummer car, and was paid £5 a week for his silence at a time when ratings were being paid 3 shillings a day. According to Neild, Mountbatten, known as LL, used brandy and lemonade to help seduce the boys, who ranged in ages from 8 to 12. And that once he saw Lord Mountbatten in bed with a prostitute and 2 teenage girls, who tried unsuccessfully to seduce him for more than an hour. The prostitute, Barbara Harris, declared him unfit for the sandwich treatment. Barbara Harris always brought some clothing like that for a baby girl, but outsize, large enough, in fact, for one of those boys to wear, Neild said. Obviously, it had been specially made, and she would hand it to LL with the boy. In the beginning, I didn't see what went on in the room, but one didn't have to be a genius to guess what was going on. Neild claims the link between Lord Mountbatten and Harris was London's fashionable wartime Pink Petal Club. LL was a close friend of Noel Coward, who was also a patron of the club. Barbara Harris, through her notoriety in the early sex scandal, became friendly with LL and was a well-known face at the club. Twigg warned me to be most careful about what I heard and saw. He said I was picked for the job because they believed I could be discreet. He later told me that LL was under a lot of pressure and released his tension with his fondness for young boys dressed as small girls. Well, if any of this is true, my final decision has been made. I have stood on the fence for the longest with this Mountbatten. I know he was rather winsome, but are you actually for real right now? 8 to 12-year-old boys dressed up as girls because you were under a lot of stress. Sir, you have put yourself under a lot of stress. You're the one that's decided that you want to take on every job that was ever created in the British government. You've been the one that's got to climb that ladder. If you're under stress, I'm sorry, but is that the 8-year-old's fault? Why should he have to take it? He also told me that LL engaged in sex with men or even girls if they were youthful enough. He told me that LL was confused sexually, to put it mildly, and that I was being paid very well to keep my mouth shut. Okay, your sexual confusion is not the 8-year-old's problem. It all ceased when the Admiral was taken ill, thank God. On his recovery late 1943, he went to Southeast Asia as Supreme Commander of the Allied Forces. There's no reason for Neild to make up a story, especially in so much detail, though certain details don't fit the conventional story. He says that at the time Mountbatten was living in a large house in Fareham near Portsmouth, but in 1942 to 1943 Mountbatten was head of combined operations and based in London. However, Southwick House at Farnham was, from 1943, the location of the advanced command post of the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, which Mountbatten would have had cause to visit, and he may have used a house nearby. Broadlands is about an hour's drive from Farnham. Peter Thompson, a former Mirror editor, writing in Diana's Nightmare, told of how an informant came to Fleet Street to sell a story alleging deviant behavior by Mountbatten. Maxwell bought the story and suppressed it. It was a small but important favor. The cookery writer, Clarissa Dixon Wright, told Thompson that her uncle Douglas Wright, as a surgeon commander, had served with Mountbatten during the Second World War. Wright was summoned into Mountbatten's cabin and found him taking a bath. Dickey proceeded to make a pass at the doctor, but was turned down. "What about your career?" asked Lord Louis. "You don't understand," replied Dr. Wright. "I'm planning to make a career outside the Navy." When Mountbatten persisted, he was told, "Just remember, I'm the doctor, the man with the needle." Sure enough, said his relative, Mountbatten got a dose of the clap in the Far East, and Dr. Wright had to treat him. Well, good for that doctor. Didn't get taken down. Anthony Daly, whose memoir The Abuse of Power recounts his experiences as a rent boy to the rich and famous during the 1970s, was particularly close to Tom Dryburgh, who told him that, quote, he flew to Ceylon in a cargo plane. On arrival at Colombo, Mountbatten sent his private Dakota to pick him up, and he was flown to HQ at a place improbably called Candy. Tom said that after cocktails, one of Mountbatten's aides offered him a Burmese boy, whom everybody at headquarters called Candy. Tom had sex with Candy in the Dakota. Tom really did give me the impression that Mountbatten actually preferred men to women, wishful thinking on his part perhaps, and said that both had frank, not to say graphic, discussions about homosexuality. They discussed the pornography they liked. Tom offered to show me his collection, but I declined. And Tom said Mountbatten had something of a fetish for uniforms. Handsome young men in military uniforms, with high boots, and beautiful boys in school uniforms. Daly picked up gossip from the circles that he moved in and was told Mountbatten had a sexual preference for well-bred, well-educated young men of good standing. Daly says that would have ruled me out. And he said that Mountbatten really liked boys from good families or public school boys. He chose not to mention Mountbatten in the abuse of power, but described how Mountbatten had been courted by members of the National Association for Freedom, later the Freedom Association, who were plotting against Harold Wilson. The Mountbatten connection here, as told to me by Noel Annan Lord, was that this group was very actively trying to enlist Mountbatten to their cause, and that their enticements included a position of power and prestige and to offer him various young men for sex. You may recall from the book that I endured a full night with Annan. It was he who led me to believe that there was what I would now describe as an Anglo-Irish vice ring, with the landed gentry on both sides of the Irish border abusing boys and young men. He told me that the venues for parties were the grand houses they owned. The young grenadier guard I was teamed up with for a pornographic photographic session told me that he had been transferred by helicopter to an elite gathering in a castle in either Belfast or possibly just minutes over the border. Mountbatten's castle, Classy-Bon, was just 12 miles from the NI border. Annan appeared to be very knowledgeable about all things establishment and spy-related, and their indiscretions. He told me Mountbatten was bisexual and had affairs with numerous young men, including an Indian prince. The former Conservative minister, Keith Joseph, had said that Mountbatten had affairs with many young sailors while at sea. He said such liaisons were perfectly normal for men at sea, but he had said that Mountbatten also bedded countless women. Mountbatten's sexuality seemed to be an open secret in circles I moved in. In 1980, an article appeared in International Times claiming that Cecil King was so annoyed at Mountbatten's failure to take part in his coup that he, quote, was forever spewing out low-minded and scandalous observations about his former idol to anyone who'd listen. Even when he was rung up from Dublin by a television journalist to discover his reaction to Mountbatten's execution by the IRA, he maintained that Mountbatten was, quote, a sexual pervert, and that his wife Edwina had been a nymphomaniac. That same year, Now magazine published an article under the headline, Mountbatten was part of a gay ring which was linked with Kincora, in which the Northern Irish writer Robin Bryans claimed that leading British establishment figures were in a vice ring which abused boys from the notorious Kincora home in East Belfast, and that the late Louis Mountbatten, Captain Peter Montgomery, a former intelligence officer from Northern Ireland, Sir Anthony Blunt, the infamous homosexual MI5 traitor, and Peter England, a senior member of the British Secret Service, who served undercover at Stormont in the 1970s, were members of an old boy network which held gay orgies in country houses and castles on both sides of the Irish border. It added that Mountbatten was a great one for boys in the first year of public school, like at Patora Royal, which was 13 and 14. In April 1990, Now magazine returned to the subject with an article which claimed that according to some Belfast journalists, Mountbatten lived a secret life in Ireland. Lord Mountbatten was interested in what homosexuals called the rough trade, and liked to have contacts with working-class youths. Robin Bryans, also known as Robert Harbinson, a few months later made the same accusation in a private letter claiming Kincora and Portora boys' schools were used as homosexual brothels by many prominent figures, including Lord Mountbatten and James Molyneux. He went on to say of Mountbatten that in the 1930s he had shared Anthony Blunt's butch lover Alan Price. Now magazine articles and Robin Bryans' claims were dismissed, but now a new person has come forward who is using a pseudonym. Sean was 16 years old when he says he was driven from the Kincora boys' home in Belfast to Classy-Bon in the summer of 1977. As the men who had brought them waited outside, Sean remembered being taken into a darkened room where he was joined by a man who dressed me and then gave me oral sex. I was there for about an hour. He spoke quietly and he tried to make me feel comfortable. He was one of those men who wanted attention. He wanted you to chase him. I think he felt some shame. He said very sadly, I hate these feelings. He seemed a sad and lonely person. I think the darkened room was all about denial. He grabbed my hand and put it on his chest. I only recognized who he was when I saw on the news that Lord Mountbatten had been killed. What a story. Another 16-year-old boy, who was using a pseudonym, remembers being brought to Mullimore during the summer of 1977. Amal says that he met Mountbatten 4 times that summer on a day trip from Belfast. Each time the encounter, lasting an hour, took place in a suite at a hotel by the harbour about 15 minutes from Classybon. Amal remembered, "He was very polite, he's very nice. I knew he was someone important. He asked if I wanted a drink or candy, and he told me he liked dark-skinned people, especially Sri Lankan people, as they were very friendly and very good-looking. I remember he admired my smooth skin. We gave each other oral sex in the 69 position. He was very tender and I felt comfortable about it. It seemed very natural. I knew that several other boys from Kincor were brought to him on other occasions." Yuck. Yuck, 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 yuck. Need to drink some bleach just to wash my mouth out. Hints at Mountbatten's bisexuality were provided by Ron Perks, who has spoken for the first time about an episode over 70 years ago. Perks, who served in the Royal Marines from 1944 to 57, was appointed Mountbatten's driver on his arrival in Malta in 1948. Mountbatten's predecessor, commanding the 1st Crew Squadron, Rear Admiral R.V. Simons Taylor, had told him, "You're going to be the driver of my successor, and I want you to find out all these places." The Red House near Raybot was amongst them. It was an isolated baronial-style building with a flat roof. One day, as we were driving along, Mountbatten asked if I knew the Red House, and I said I did, and he asked if I would take him there, which I did. I never dropped him there, but he had his own car, which he often used. He wouldn't have asked me for nothing. I didn't know what it was, and only learnt after I came out of the service that it was an upmarket gay brothel and used for senior naval officers. You're taught to keep out of trouble in the Navy, and I've never said a word about the incident until now. The son of one of the ADCs on Mountbatten's staff said that while his, quote, father was posted at Shape in the mid-1950s, he remembered a succession of young men being taken up to Lord Mountbatten's suite in a hotel in Paris, which raised a few eyebrows at the time. I was particularly struck by my father's disapproval, as he was not a particularly censorious person, and I think that it was the indiscretion of Mountbatten's behavior which surprised him most. My father left no doubt that the young men were there for sexual favors and not part of the Army Civil Service. I have always imagined that it was in the evening and would have been single men, but on a regular basis. The way my father told the story implied that a significant number of people knew about it, hence his disapproval. One of Mountbatten's most fruitful sources of young men was the lifeguards. Nick Best, who served in the Grenadier Guards, remembers that, quote, "It was said that Mountbatten was the colonel of the lifeguards. He always took every new officer out to dinner to explore the homosexual potential." The writer Nigel West is convinced Mountbatten was bisexual for 3 reasons. 1. My father worked for Mountbatten on the joint planning staff at Candy and heard about the outrage when Mountbatten arranged for the transfer of the alleged boyfriend Peter Murphy. 2. A good friend of mine, name redacted, was very shocked when he applied to join the Lifeguards or some similar small cavalry regiment and was offered an interview with Mountbatten, I think through a godfather, who then promptly positioned him. Name redacted was appalled. Allegedly, at around the same time, Mountbatten was caught with a guardsman in St. James Park, and the palace declined to intervene when the Yard reported the incident. And number 3, when I was working at the BBC's General Features Department at Kensington House in 1978, a neighboring program filmed an interview with Mountbatten at his request in which he acknowledged his homosexuality. The rumor was that the film, intended to be broadcast after his death, was suppressed by the palace. When interviewed, the friend of Nigel West said that he had met Mountbatten for a very good lunch at White's Club. Quote, "He was very charismatic and attractive, and wit and humor will get you everywhere. It was certainly true of Mountbatten. He was bloody funny. Age meant nothing to him. If you had a bit of gumption, he liked you. About 2/3 of the way through the lunch, his hand appeared on my knee and stayed there. Weston warned me he was a switch hitter and would bonk anything, so I wasn't surprised. We just made a joke of it. Why do you think I'm colonel and the chief of the lifeguards?" he said. "We've such beautiful boys." Mountbatten's male love for the last 8 years of his life is now in his 70s. He looks considerably younger. Handsome, smartly dressed, and well-spoken, meeting for lunch, he remembers his times with Mountbatten, a near neighbor, with great affection. "He was lovely, great fun. I saw him at least once a month, sometimes for a chat, sometimes for more. He was a great mentor to me, introduced me to all sorts of useful people, and we had lovely times together. He was perfectly relaxed about our relationship, in spite of the 40-year age gap, and certainly felt no shame. I was always up for sex, so happy to see him. He would ring to warn me when he wanted to pop round. John Barrett knew all about it and did not mind. His death was a great shock. Further evidence of Mountbatten's bisexuality comes from FBI files. In February 1944, the American writer and society figure, Elizabeth de la Poer Beresford Baroness Decies, was interviewed by the FBI about another matter, but the FBI report reads, "She has been an intimate of the British Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mary, and her ladies-in-waiting. She states that in those circles Lord Louis Mountbatten and his wife are considered persons of extremely low morals. She stated that Lord Louis Mountbatten was known to be homosexual with a perversion for young boys. In Lady Decies' opinion, he is an unfit man to direct any sort of military operation because of this condition. She stated further that his wife, Lady Mountbatten, was considerably equally erratic, and that it was known that Paul Robeson, colored singer and actor, was her paramour. At the present time, Lady Decies is residing in the Plaza Hotel in New York and appears to have no special motive in making the above statements. With the exception of the fact that Lady Decies is greatly worried about the safety of her Paris home, she appears to be otherwise normal." Julius Amos's accusations in 1952 against the Mountbattens had been dismissed by the FBI, but in November 1955, an FBI file was opened on Edwina, most probably because of her close associations with Krishna Menon and her various political pronouncements on India and Africa and during the Suez Crisis. The FBI, at the same time, sent a report to the Department of Justice on Mountbatten's homosexuality. In April 1957, the FBI produced a memo on allegations of an affair between Paul Robeson and Edwina, and in September 1959, her file was again reviewed. That's wild that there was a file between Edwina and Paul Robeson. Who cares about that when you've got somebody who is literally abusing kids? Like, y'all, we gotta get our priorities straight. In May 1968, further accusations against Mountbatten were supplied to the FBI by John Grombach, who had been described as one of the most remarkable and yet least known intelligence leaders in American history. Grombach, a brigadier in the New York National Guard, under cover of a company called Industrial Reports, ran his own independent spy operations for J. Edgar Hoover, known informally as the Pond, that conducted espionage operations for the U.S. government from 1942 to 1955. An international fencer who also claimed to have been a stunt double in Hollywood movies, Grombach had been educated at West Point and worked in the State Department during the war dealing with British intelligence. He told the FBI, quote, "The person who furnished a report in 1953 regarding the alleged homosexuality of Anthony Eden, Earl Mountbatten, and Anthony Nutting was believed to be Lady Judith Listowel. Listowel had studied at Budapest University and the London School of Economics, where she met Billy Hare, the future 5th Earl Listowel and Secretary of State for India, which gave her access to British social and political circles. Her soirees in Belgrave Place during the war were famous. They had married in 1933 but divorced 12 years later, and she later served in the Hungarian diplomatic service and worked as a journalist and a writer. Much of Mountbatten's FBI file, only part of which was released after Freedom of Information requests, remains closed. Some of the Kincora files at the British National Archives from the late 1970s and early 80s are, quote, temporarily retained by department, while still others, which were due for release in 2018, were in August that year extended for a further period. One has to ask why. Now, the author ends this chapter by asking a very good question, and that is, did this deviance in Mountbatten happen because he was abused as a child? There's so often a link between adulthood deviance and abuse as a child, and he lays out a very convincing case. So he asks the question, was Mountbatten perhaps abused as a young boy? The 13-year-old Dickie, recovering from whooping cough and bronchitis, spent several weeks alone at Bridport in Dorset in the summer of 1914 with a private tutor called Frederick Lawrence Long. Long, then in his early 30s, had left the Royal Navy to train for the ministry a few years earlier and was doing some private tutoring. The friendship between Mountbatten and Long, which continued after their sojourn in Bridport, was close. Long was to officiate at Mountbatten's wedding, and is marked by some intense correspondence. Yes, it's weird letters from this tutor to his student. One read, "Dear kid, I have one special pupil now, Prince John de Mauw. He is about your age and a decent enough kid, but you need not be jealous, as you know there's only one Dick in the world for me, and there never will be anyone before or anywhere near him in my affections. wrote Long to Dickie in February 1916. It's hardly necessary for me to add that I'd give anything to wipe the floor with you. What? Goodbye, my best beloved and dearest kid. With all my love, ever yours affectionately, F. Lawrence Long. All right, you weirdo. He doesn't stop there, though. Shortly afterwards, Long, who never married, wrote to his former pupil, I don't expect you to know how much I would have given for a line from you, dear, for several reasons, but don't worry yourself. And anyway, God bless you for the times of happiness we've had together, and keep you always safe in body and soul. All my love to my best friend. Your tutor is not your best friend, and your student is not the one that you turn to for affection. Then, after Mountbatten had been the first to congratulate Long on his ordination later that month, he wrote, You won't find that ordination makes me any the less yours, or you any the less mine, although I think I understand just what you felt. However many things there may be to do and think about, there will always be time to think about you, and in the way that will be of most use. The use of those envelopes is a sound idea, very as I always have had an idea you wish to say more, and in some ways that you care to do. You are constantly in my thoughts. Best of love, your devoted Lawrence. Quite apart from the familiarity of Long's letters, one has to question, given Mountbatten kept almost every letter sent to him, and this was clearly a close friendship, why there is so little correspondence between the two men in Mountbatten's archives, and why should a tutor and his pupil communicate through double envelopes? Even though Long officiated at his wedding, Mountbatten makes no reference to him in his letters to his family, nor does he appear in any book on Mountbatten. It is a relationship worthy of a closer study. Indeed. That would probably make a book on it itself. That's the end of that chapter, so this is the end of our episode. Oh, well, I just feel disgusted, horrified. Mountbatten was not a good person. And that's the conclusion I've come to, and no one will ever take that conclusion away from me. Anybody who is even one time going to decide to get his people to bring him children from a nearby school so that he can dress them up as girls and then proceed to abuse them, irredeemable. Irredeemable. And I don't care if he was able to manipulate the world. Everybody around him who knew this was going on and knew that he had a proclivity for boys and just was like, well, that's Dickie, or whatever sorry, sad sack excuse they had. Those people, irredeemable. If you know abuse is happening and you just kind of like, well, you know, like, you're not worried about how this is going to affect this kid, the trajectory of his life. You don't need to, like, be as therapized as we are in this current age to know, hey, you know what? If a grown-up takes advantage of a kid, that's probably going to wreck them for the rest of their life. It's going to mark who they are for the rest of their life. They're going to struggle sexually for the rest of their life because of this adult that took advantage. I have zero time for any person who knows child abuse is going on and is like, well, I don't want to get my hands dirty. How about, you worried about getting your soul dirty? You worried about answering to God when you have to stand in front of him and be like, yeah, I knew about all those kids that were getting abused and I just didn't do anything because, don't want to get in people's business. So I'm grossed out by Mountbatten, but I'm equally grossed out by how many people knew it was happening and then just was like, well, fiddly-dee, it's not my problem. What else are you put here for but to try to help people when you find out that there's a problem? Was there something bigger that you were doing? Was there something more important that you needed to do? And to this John Barrett joker who's like, I didn't know anything about that. He wasn't doing anything like that. I knew him for 14 years. You knew he was with kids and you didn't do anything about it? And, by the way, not just boys, too, because, we knew that there were some pretty young girls that he was calling up to have over to the house. Oh, it's appalling when you hear, that these poor public school boys were being carted in and used and abused. But, hey, man, he was doing it to, young girls, too. This guy was a pervert. He was an absolute pervert. I don't care what he did. Also, yeah, he did great mighty things, I suppose, across the century, and his name is mixed up in everything. But he was a manipulative bastard who constantly twisted people's arms, didn't listen to what people wanted to do, went over people's heads, used that royal title constantly and continually. I don't care if he had good manners. Is that really, are people so easily hoodwinked? Apparently. All right, well, I'm fired up. So if you guys feel as fired up as I am, tell me what you think in the comments. What do you think about that chapter? It was pretty shocking. Am I right? Y'all told me. You kept saying, well, wait till you get to the end. Well, I'm here, and color me astounded that this person was doing this, and such great measure too, so indiscreetly. All right, thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, and let's see, in all truth, how much more do we have left in this book? Let me check real quick for us. One more chapter. So next Sunday is our last episode of this book, and this week is our last episode of the Kennedys. So my goodness, what will I be reading on this channel? I'll tell you what I am reading. Andrew Lowney comes out with his book on Andrew. We're definitely reading that. So that's already, I already knew I was reading that, but it's just not out yet. But I still haven't figured out what we're going to read between when that book comes out and now. So I'm looking. I just haven't seen what I wanted. All right, I will see you guys later. Thank you guys so much for hanging in there with me for such a long episode. I appreciate it. And I will talk to you guys later. Bye.